All right. Everyone hear me okay? So we've had this opportunity over the last year to work with Procter & Gamble on an audit automation project with the goal of taking some of their auditing procedures and accounts receivable and turning them into formalized rules that we can throw into either a monitoring type system or a continuous auditing type system where we actually do transactions testing. And this is one of several projects that we have Rutgers working with Procter & Gamble. And so just to kind of show you what we're working on in our project is we see audit automation as a really important element of enabling a remote audit. And we'll get to what I mean by that in just a moment. But essentially the way that we have this structured is, first of all, we'll give you an idea of our goals, where we are currently on this project. Then we'll look at how automation fits into that remote audit framework, as well as some of the different ways that we've approached this problem at Procter & Gamble. And we've learned a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting insights into how things can work, how things might not work the best way, and whether things can work as they are or what needs to happen in order for them to be incorporated into a continuous monitoring, continuous auditing platform. So Procter & Gamble, of course, in Cincinnati, Ohio, a large consumer goods firm, has this problem. They want to work on automating their objectives. The primary goal of this was to automate their auditing procedures in order to run them on a continuous or more periodic basis. And feel free to chime in if I am a little fuzzy on the details. And then our extended goal, in their audit department in-house, have been working on developing ways to allow them to perform some of these audit tests that they have remotely. So being able to access information on an electronic data storage, or being able to have some sort of e-filing mechanism in place. And so we look at this, we say, okay, here are our manual accounts receivable tests. We want to put them into automated procedures. So then that becomes another tool that helps them be able to perform this remote audit, which has benefits of reducing costs, increasing efficiency, and allowing the internal auditors to do more work. At this point, we haven't successfully found a way to take the existing rules and put them into, an easy automated format. We are looking at ways that we can even automate partially some of the control objectives so that we can take advantage of reducing some of the more menial tasks. But in this particular case, there are issues with the way the business processes are organized, the ways that the data is stored within the system that we have to work around. So before we can use this really to aid our remote audit, we have to tackle this first issue here.
One point I'd like to make is that when we initially got in the project, we were trying to look at the total, really from a global standpoint, to automate it from a global standpoint rather than focusing on the smaller bits and pieces of an audit program. I mean, the way I kind of look at it today, after working on it with Ryan and Procter & Gamble, is that we were trying to automate an elephant. And now what we got to do is get back and try to figure out how to automate this mouse. I mean, I think that's kind of where we are, because we were biting off too much from an automation standpoint.
So just to zoom out real quick, this is some research that we've done here at Rutgers. We've looked at some of the literature that's out there on using remote technology to enable what we call a remote audit. In this case, it's more talking about a virtual audit team in the sense where you can have auditors who work remotely, interface with other audit team members who may be on site working with the business managers. We break it into these two sections where we have communication, which occurs here on the left, so using web conferencing and video calls to talk with people, follow up on interviews or in the planning process. And then over on the right, we have the analytics. So the access of technology allows us to do extractions and collect information and collect evidence without necessarily having to be on site. And so we want to build this into our model. And the automation kind of takes the automation is an important aspect of that analytical process. Because if we can get rid of some of this menial task and offload it onto the computer, then we can spend more of our time as auditors dealing with the exceptions, following up with the real problems in the higher risk areas within the firm. So with automation, we look at, we want to be able to allow full population testing to see whether we have anomalies or other issues. And also we want to direct auditors' attention to these high-risk exceptions and alerts. And then we break it into testing the transactions, which is more on the continuous auditing aspect, versus the testing the controls to make sure that the systems are in place, the controls are in place, so that users don't have unauthorized access, so they can't go in the system and do things they ought not to. And the way we approach this is we have kind of this modular automated approach. So this is kind of a holistic view of the company. From the top, you have the economic cycle, which deals with the revenue process, the revenue cycle, and then you break it down into individual areas. So we look at the business function. In this case, we were working with accounts receivable. Going further into this, the way that Procter & Gamble, and this is stuff that we've seen at Siemens as well, they break it into control objectives, control activities, and down to the minute control tests. And just to give you a little bit of context, Procter & Gamble has about 65 different audit areas that they deal with, so accounts receivable is one of those. And when it comes to control tests, there are about 1,100 control tests throughout the entire audit process. And so any chance that we can take to take these and put them and offload them onto the computer where appropriate can significantly aid the work that the auditors are doing. And so just to give you a standpoint, we started with accounts receivable. Another thing that we've been working on, or that we've discovered as we've worked through this, is that we want to started as low level as possible, so starting with the control tests that are already in place, the actual SAP transactions or the tables that have specific elements that we want to test, and find what we call the low-hanging fruit, those things that have some sort of computerized equivalent. And the nice thing is if we start with those, there's not a lot of re-engineering effort. If we can take some of these processes, formalize them, convert them into rules, we don't have to mess with the system too much. As we go up, if we zoom out and look at the control activities, then we're starting to look at, okay, if we can't automate the tests individually, what kind of proxy can we come up with? What other types of tests would give us the same result and would give us a useful indicator of whether the controls were working? In those cases, we have to re-engineer the audit processes, so the actual elements that we're testing, trying to find things that may be in the system that may be indicators. And then as we zoom out further to our control objectives at a higher level, this requires more looking at, okay, what are we auditing? Where are our high-risk areas? And if we threw everything out the window, what would it look like if we worked on those tests? Or what would the tests look like to analyze those specific areas? And obviously, as we zoom out, in many cases, we have to start looking at ways we have to change the technology. So can we change the audit process? Is that sufficient enough to give us the advantage of automation? Or do we have to go in there and work with business process owners to help them change their processes, which we know is a very tricky and difficult challenge. So here we have, we okay, Don?
Yeah.
All right. So the first approach was starting at this low level, working with the tests, and we had about 40 different audit tests that we were working with. And similar to what we did with Siemens, we broke these into categories where we said these ones are automatable, these ones are partially automatable, these ones, if we did some re-engineering, might be possible, and these ones are completely manual. People are still using paper and pencil, so they're out. Which is still the case in a lot of businesses. As much as we'd like to stand back and pretend that everybody is using computerized systems for their entire business process, particularly in larger companies, and Procter & Gamble deals with a lot of acquisitions and bringing in different systems, we have to look at this from a higher level. Our second approach, the first approach, a lot of the controls that are in place, the tests that they have, were included a large portion of a manual procedure. So there was a lot of documentation checking, so actually looking for signatures on forms, or evaluating different types of information that the business processes had, looking for authorizations that existed on a paper authorization control sheet. So from that perspective, then our second approach was to zoom out a little bit and look at, okay, here we have, let's look at the control activities and see what we can do there. Now internally, the internal audit department we were working with, and Brandy Strazener is a wonderful person to work with, she and her team had actually gone through and looked at the different control objectives in this, or the control activities within accounts receivable, and broken them apart into what they thought could be done remotely, which ties in actually quite well with what we're looking at automating, because they were able to lay out some of the groundwork, some of the requirements that would need to be in place in order for them to connect remotely with a particular department or look at information on a server. It included some e-filing procedures, if there was e-filing where the process managers would scan the information and have it in some electronic repository. They identified these and said, okay, we can do some of these remotely. And so we approached the control activities from this perspective. So what are the prerequisites that we have for these 24 different control activities? And so we determined the prerequisites. We looked at proposing new tests for the different queries that they had. So trying to figure out, okay, here is the control activity for evaluating whether we had approvals for particular held orders. How could we do that? What would be a test that we could do in their existing system that would allow us to validate that the orders that were released by someone who was authorized? And so we looked at different tests and proposed some different ways of looking at that. And we haven't been entirely successful in that area because, again, a lot of it is either not digitized or it has a very large manual portion to it that doesn't lend itself to really easy, snap audit automation. So our third approach was to zoom out a little bit further. And we looked at, okay, what are the overall goals of this particular control over accounts receivable? And we broke it into some areas. So we looked at, for example, collectability and aging of accounts. We looked at credit limits and how that might affect particular orders that were being held up in the approval process. There were miscellaneous accounts receivable, and how did they work together in order to, or what risks were specifically involved with dealing with accounts receivable. And finally, looking at it a little more creatively, we say, okay, so we have these different control areas, and we've looked at the different risks of those areas. So how often do the auditors find exceptions in those areas, and how often do they have to deal with these? And then what about looking at a higher level? Can we link some of these customers who have higher risk credit profiles to the aging of their accounts? Do they happen to have, are there trends there? Are there different indicators that might submit that there is an issue in those areas? And so right now we're working on, this is kind of our work in process, determining what kind of tests specifically within the system would be useful in allowing us to automate the overall control objectives here.
Yeah, one of the constraints is that we can't go back and look at trying to re-engineer the business process to meet the audit objective. And so that's why when we started looking at this and trying to automate it from a global basis, that was one of the issues we got into, because what we would do, we would look at areas and then we'd come up with, well, if we had this field or that field, or if we had this process in place, then we could audit it. But the problem is to have the business unit change its process to satisfy the audit requirement is not palatable within an organization, as you might suspect.
Exactly. So within these constraints, we're trying to find ways that we can look at these different elements. And we've learned a lot of ways that don't necessarily work in a particularly straightforward manner. And they've helped us to focus our efforts on these more minute details, these minute tests, where we can take specific elements of them, automate a little bit of it to make the tests usable in the current audit plan, and hopefully in a remote setting as well. So this is our work in process. This is still going on. We're looking at some of the different areas that we might be able to find some more of this lower hanging fruit, some of these more easily accessible areas. Again, we focus on accounts receivable because there's high risk in the area. There's potential for finding some really useful cost savings in the audit process. We also have this constraint or this idea where we want to find audit tests or automated tests that solve simple problems. Because the simplest solution is generally the best one. And when we get a little bit too creative and try and look at these higher level and more global elements, we end up with something that isn't necessarily usable. And so trying to find the constraints, trying to find the fit for that. Trying to align our goals, particularly as we're looking at automating the process and making sure that we're focusing on the same areas, focusing on the right tests, focusing on those elements that are important to the company is an issue. And finally, we want to be able to look at all of the different alternatives that are out there. So ways that we can reevaluate the rules, pull it out of perspective and kind of look at it from different angles so that we can address those with hopefully more useful tests that would help enable the auditors in their processes. So we gained a lot of insight into the audit process throughout this past year working with Procter & Gamble. We're still working on it. We're looking at expanding it and trying to find some different areas where we can work on this. We've identified several areas where we could re-engineer business processes if that were a feasible task. Kind of looking at, in a utopian ideal society, what would it look like? What would we have access to in order to complete an audit that was as less involved than the current processes? And we've addressed some of the potential areas. We've found some of these areas where if we were able to automate this, if we had the process or we had the documentation the way that we wanted it, that the auditors would be able to offload that kind of tedious, mundane auditing task so they could focus more on following up, dealing with the exceptions, dealing with the managers and collecting evidence, which hopefully I think is kind of one of the goals of the whole continuous auditing, continuous monitoring process in general, is getting rid of some of these things, finding more intelligent ways to discover the data, and let the auditors use their expertise, use their insight and their knowledge in order to find these particular things.
Well, one of the